Hey, welcome to episode 19 of the Ascendancy podcast. I'm Austin.
And I'm Chris.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking about what makes someone a vegan. So, what are the character traits of a person who becomes vegan? And also, what are the character traits of someone who may potentially not become vegan? And to start off, I think one of the most fundamental traits of someone who accepts veganism and really any consistent ethical stance is having integrity, moral integrity, and a sense of justice. And I would categorize this as having basic decency. So if you have someone who cares about the consequences of their actions and desires to not, make the world a worse off place because of their existence, that person is, of course, going to be more likely to accept the fact that humans should not exploit our fellow beings, which is a definition of veganism. So, having that integrity, that sense of justice, is the foundation of someone who is vegan. And likewise, if you have someone who lacks integrity, they don't have a sense of justice, they don't care about, what's right or what's wrong, you're going to have a much more difficult time getting that person to accept veganism. And that's a lot of what we see actually in outreach is that people will try to argue against veganism using straw mans, and they really want to avoid the moral side of the equation, which doesn't make sense because that's ultimately what veganism is, an ethical stance. What's your take on that, Chris?
Yeah, thank you for leading us off, Austin. And that's a really strong point to start the episode with because having integrity and a sense of right and wrong is absolutely essential. As you defined it, veganism is the principle that humans should live without exploiting animals because we recognize their individuality, their sentience. We want to respect their welfare, just like we want to be respected if we were, in their position. We wouldn't want to be subjugated and enslaved for the benefit of others. And integrity is just a absolute must. If you can't understand right and wrong and you don't adhere to consistent ethical principles, you're not going to grasp veganism. You're not going to understand the importance of it. So yeah, I totally agree. And going into the next point here, it's going to be having a growth and accountability mindset. So the way I would define a growth mindset is as opposed to like a fixed mindset, because that's kind of how the concept was created. I'm not sure which person or psychologist or author created it, but having a growth mindset is understanding that you can improve, that you can become better. When you're faced with new information, you're not stuck at the level that you're at, and which is what a fixed mindset is. It's just that you have a predetermined abilities based on your genetics or your environment, and there's little growth that you can have. You're just kind of stuck where you're at. So when it comes to growth mindset, it's when you get new information or you see something that's going on, you recognize your potential for growth, to become a better person, to become better ultimately. And it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are, what you've done in the past, you can grow and become better. Sometimes you hear people say, I'm 68 years old, or I'm 70 years old, I'm too old to become vegan, I'm like just stuck in my way. That's a fixed mindset. Whereas opposed to, I've read and met many people who've become vegan even in their older age because they have a growth mindset. They see that they're not just stuck in the way they've been living for 70 years. They see this injustice and they see that they can grow and become better and just evolve to become more respectful of all sentient beings on the planet. And the second part is the accountability mindset, is just understanding that, we don't live in a vacuum. Our actions have consequences, and there are no actions more harmful than, being non-vegan. You're directly causing animals to be enslaved, exploited, and, tortured to death. And having the accountability to understand that your money is directly causing that, it takes a certain level of, like I said, accountability to recognize that, you got to look at yourself in the mirror and be like, geez, I'm seeing what's going on to these animals. They're being exploited to death. I have to look at the man in the mirror, as they say, and just realize that's happening because of me, because of my money, because of my choices. I gotta stop doing this. This can't be happening because of me. So without that piece, you can just, float through life and not really, think about what the consequences of your actions are. But having that accountability is huge. So what do you think about that, Austin?
Absolutely. Accountability is a major factor. When I look back at the people who I personally helped go vegan, the people who I knew as friends and family who made the change, it was always people who have a high degree of personal accountability who went vegan. The people who I knew who would always put things off or, dodge any sort of accountability were the last people to change, or in many cases, didn't change because they don't want to reflect on their actions or how they impact others. In their mind, they're infallible. They can do no wrong. Why would I look and examine how my actions impact animals or think about, you know, what I'm actually doing? They have this default perspective where they're in the right and they don't want to accept growth or accountability. So certainly. And that leads me to the next trait of someone who becomes vegan, and that's empathy. And before I talk about empathy, I do want to make the point that veganism isn't predicated on empathy. You don't have to be an empathetic person to be vegan, and veganism isn't bound to any sort of emotional state, but it's undeniable that people who are more empathetic, especially empathetic to animals, are more likely to be vegan, because when we see the reality of exploitation, when we see the reality of slaughter, we put ourselves in the position of that victim. So we feel their suffering and we see the terror in their eyes and we can understand that. And I think that is a very common trait among people who went vegan, is seeing this reality of animal exploitation, putting ourselves in the position of the victim and thinking, I would not want that happening to me if I was in that position, or even feeling it. A lot of us, like I know for example myself, when I watched Earthlings and I saw what was happening to animals, I didn't just see it, I felt it, and I think that empathy is a huge stimulus for people really getting it quickly on a deep level. And that's not to say that if a person isn't empathetic, they shouldn't be vegan or can't be vegan, but it really does help foster the urgency of being vegan. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are some really solid points. And I want to also emphasize that veganism, like you said, it's not predicated on love, compassion, or you're being nice to animals per se. It's just about basic respect and decency. Like you said, it just happens that, if you have a higher empathy score and you're more able to put yourself in other shoes and really feel what they're feeling, seeing the mink in the cage going in circles. You see the elephant enchained in the circus swaying back and forth, and you see in their eyes the pain that they're going through, the isolation. You see the absolute terror in the eyes of the chickens in the cages before they're shackled upside down, their throats are slit, before pigs are gassed to death. You see all that and you feel that pain as if it's your own. It's just straightforward that you're more likely to become vegan because you just cannot fathom causing that to any innocent beings any longer. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. So going into the next trait here, it's going to be having higher disagreeability. So I think this is something that isn't talked about a lot, but recognizing veganism and embracing it and making that change, it requires disagreeability. So we live in a society that's made it so normalized to look at animals as objects, as dispensable commodities, as dollar signs. And everywhere you look, you turn on the TV, you see advertisements encouraging you to eat pizza, eat burgers, eat, breast milk, eat eggs, eat the flesh of animals all day. Every restaurant you go to, every store, every gas station, you see leather boots, you see, fur coats, you see it all around our society. It's so normalized. So becoming vegan, you need to be disagreeable. You need to say, no, this is not okay. This is not going to fly with me. I'm going to change, my behaviors. I'm going to change my lifestyle. People invite you to like a pig roast or something, or a circus or a zoo. You have to be disagreeable. You have to say, no, I'm not down with this. Animals are not our toys, our objects to exploit. So it takes, some of that, some courage. You could say that is a trait as well that can fit in this section. Some courage, some disagreeability to say, all these things are normalized, and I'm not just going to be part of the crowd. I'm going to say, no, this doesn't fly with me. This is not cool. Animals deserve respect, and I'm not going to just acquiesce and just go with the crowd and just do what everyone else says. I'm going to say no when something's unacceptable, and I'm going to show it with my actions. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. It's not enough just to say, well, that's really cruel. What's going on? You have to become vegan, and that's why disagreeability is a really important trait for this. So, what do you think about that, Austin?
Well said. And when we look at historical injustices, agreeability really shapes the masses of people following in line with potentially evil ideologies. It takes someone to stop and say, no, I don't accept these actions, I don't accept this behavior in my personal life, to stop this falling of dominoes within society. And animal exploitation is one of these facets where if you go with the flow of society, of marketing, of media, of the common consensus, you will exploit animals, you will prey on them, because that is what the vast majority of people do. So it does take essentially having a spine and having conviction and being willing to disagree with what's mainstream or what other people do to do the right thing. And then this comes to everything that's right, every moral principle, but especially veganism. Since it is a minority position, it does take more of a spine. And that's not to say if someone's like a meek person or an agreeable person, they're not, automatically going to be non-vegan. It just requires a greater stimulus. And I think another aspect of this is it's important for someone to go vegan, sure, but especially to stay vegan in a society or a peer group, friend group, family group, where people are in favor of preying on animals. It does take a certain amount of disagreeability to be in situations to say, hey, this isn't aligned with what I think is morally right, to eat animals or wear leather or support practices that otherwise exploit animals. And we talked about some of the traits, that allow someone to become vegan or that people who become vegan possess. And let's talk about what traits a person possesses to not be vegan. And there's a few of them, and they're, common themes that we see amongst people who are, let's say, outreached. They've seen the reality of animal agriculture. They've heard good, compelling arguments for it, and they choose to remain non-vegan. One of them, a major one, is having a victim mentality. So this is when faced with a moral truth or moral position, rather than taking accountability for their actions, they're going to shift the focus to themselves. And they're going to show that, hey, I'm not culpable to change, or I'm not, subject to change because I am a victim. What about me? Oftentimes we'll see someone talking about how they can't be vegan for a reason completely unrelated to veganism. For example, poverty or convenience or their favorite food, or they'll say that, oh, well, I'm part of a minority population and people like me are oppressed. Or let's say they say, well, I'm a woman, what about the injustices that women face? Or something like this. They shift the accountability away from themselves and they focus on some kind of a narrative where they're a victim. And this is a very insidious thing to do. And this is I think it's not just a matter, of them genuinely having a victim mentality, but using this victim mentality narrative to prey on others. So I think this is very insidious, and I think the people that do this on some level are cognizant of how it's a bad line of reasoning and a bad excuse, but they view it as their like get out of jail card. They view it as their way to dodge being held accountable for their actions. And let's put things into perspective here. These animals are the most vulnerable and they're the most innocent beings on the planet by their nature. Every human on earth is in a relative position of immense power to every animal. Like if you look at animals as a group, the ones that humans have, domesticated and prey on, but really all of them, they lack the ability to withstand the domination of humans. They are essentially the ultimate victims. So, for a person who has a high degree of moral agency and power and agency and autonomy over their own life, to choose to propagate this victim mentality or to use it as an excuse to prey on others, to prey on the innocent, is something that I think is done out of a place of extreme cruelty and malice. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yeah, I think those are really solid points, Austin. And as an AB organizer, and I hold cubes of truth regularly, which are street outreach demonstrations where we show the public the reality of what happens in animal agriculture, and we influence people to become vegan. I see this all the time, people shifting accountability, trying to make themselves out to be victims. They say, well, I'm too poor to be vegan, or, I'm the man is above me. I can't worry about that right now. Like, look at me. I'm so helpless. I'm so hopeless. Like, I can't do anything. And it's pretty much always just BS. I know homeless vegans. I know vegans of color who are doing just fine. These excuses are just excuses ultimately, and it's the opposite of a accountability mindset to look at yourself as a victim, as being hapless, and you're just not able to change because of XYZ circumstance. And like you said, Austin, it's really important to drive home who the true victims are, because most people are hyper privileged and they don't even realize it. Animals have virtually no laws protecting them. If you get in harm's way, police will come to help you. Police aren't coming to help the pigs being sent to gas chambers. They're not going to be sent to help the cows that are being slaughtered for their skin. They're not being sent to circuses to help the animals who are enslaved and enchained. Like you said, humans have the ultimate privilege. With the press of a button on your phone, you can order animals to be killed, have their bodies chopped into pieces so you can eat them. There's no greater privilege. Animals are the ultimate victims. They've been oppressed for the longest time. Since the dawn of time, humans have had them under our fist. So, yeah, it's really a good point mentioning that animals are the ultimate victims, and 99% of the time, a human claiming they're the victim that they can't change is just complete BS. So, yeah, I think that's really solid. And going into the next point here, I think someone who remains non-vegan, even when they are, outreached, even after they're educated about the issue, they can't claim ignorance anymore, because there are a subset of people that aren't vegan right now, but they would become vegan if they were presented the facts, presented the issue, and held accountable for the violations they're causing to animals. So the people that, would remain non-vegan, even when presented with all this, I think a trait that is poignant here is having immaturity. So having immaturity is just basically not seeing the world with some level of seriousness, just seeing everything as something to joke about or laugh at, not really considering serious consequences of your behaviors. You're just kind of seeing the world as a joke. Like, you can't take anything seriously. That's the way I think of immaturity. And it's correlated with biological age, but not entirely, because I've met people who are very young, even 10 years old, 15 years old, who are quite mature for their age. Like, they take things seriously. Not everything's a joke. They don't cry like a baby at everything. And they're able to understand veganism, and they make that change. I've seen activists who are very young doing amazing work for animals, and on the flip side, there's immature people who are 35, 40, 50, 60 years old, and they just can't take accountability. They think everything's a joke. They troll online with their time, just wasting it away. So someone who's immature, it's going to be unlikely that they will grasp veganism and understand their accountability, and make that change to respect animals, because they think everything is just it's not serious. It's and there are serious things in this planet. Some people say, you take life too seriously and you got to live and laugh, and I understand that, but that doesn't apply to issues of justice, of issues of right and wrong. They are to be taken seriously. It is not a joke to laugh about what's going on to animals. And those people who come to the cubes of truth and they laugh at what's going on to the animals, or they're eating hot dogs in front of us, I don't even bother really interacting with them, because they're just showing me right up front they're immature, they're childish, and they just lack that maturity to understand the issue. So what do you think about all that, Austin?
Yeah, spot on. And that's a really good point that you mentioned, that maturity isn't a measure of a person's age, but more so their degree of cognizance, their degree of cognizance for their actions, their willingness to take issues seriously. And doing cubes of truth with AV, I've had young people, completely mature, level-headed. They see the footage and they get that it's wrong and they want to change. And then I've had 50, 60-year-old people mocking the agony the animals are in, or eating flesh in front of us, and things of this nature. So it's really a matter of like a personal trait rather than just like, age or something like that. And I think another important aspect, another huge trait, I would say this is maybe, in my opinion, the largest trait that people who don't go vegan have, is a predatory mentality. This idea that other beings exist for them, that it's acceptable to prey on others. I personally think that's really the core of injustice in the world, is this predatory drive or predatory nature. And it's regardless of ideology or rationale or anything thought up by philosophers. I think this innate predatory mentality that a lot of people possess is really the greatest hindrance to humanity, and the greatest reason why people aren't vegan. If you take someone and they think that it's acceptable to prey on others for their own benefit, that person is not going to be a good moral agent. That person is essentially rejecting the entire premise, the entire concept of moral agency. And this is something that goes back to really anyone who commits a serious injustice to another person, is this predatory drive. So if you have someone who looks at animals and they view them as just someone to dominate, subjugate, consume, that person is not going to become vegan, because they don't care about morality. They don't care about justice. And some of these people even have such a warped sense of reality. In their mind, preying on others is a good thing. That's something that makes them feel strong or powerful or badass, or they view their sense of masculinity or self-worth from how much they can prey on others. And I've seen that, time and time again. So if you have a predatory person, they're going to reject their moral agency, and they're not going to be vegan for the most part. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess this point kind of blends into what I'll go into next. But before I talk about that, it's actually like, it's often people will practice preying on animals before they prey on humans. It's time and time again, it's been researched. a lot of the most heinous serial killers or mass shooters, they take pleasure in preying on animals as children, as teenagers. They practice on dominating on them before they move on to humans. And this is kind of can be a whole episode in itself, but I think that predatory drive, that predatory mindset is really the root of all injustice, is that some people have this belief that because they have more power, because they can prey on others, that it's okay to do it. That might makes right. And if someone has that predatory mentality, it's very unlikely they will become vegan. And in some respect, they might be on a spectrum of like psychopathy to think that it's fine to just prey on others because they can. And this does lead into my next point, which is, someone who will remain non-vegan even when they're, shown the issue, they're cognizant of the harm that they're causing. They usually tend to be selfish and sociopathic. So this blends in with your point, Austin, about preying on others is just being selfish, only thinking about your interests, only thinking about your pleasures, only thinking about your convenience, and not considering the broader consequences of your actions. You think about, oh, well, chicken tastes so good or pizza tastes so good, I just can't give it up. It's all me, my. It's never a consideration about others. And this quality is genuinely just a huge hindrance to someone going vegan. If they're very selfish, self-oriented, the world revolves around them and their pleasures and what they want, it's unlikely they'll grasp it. And ideally their behavior would only be forced to change when the legal consequences of exploiting animals would be dire. And we're not there yet. So I think and it blends with sociopathies, is just a lack of concern for how their actions are harming others. It's just kind of just behaving impulsively, like, oh, I want this, or oh, those leather boots look cool, I want to buy those, or well, that mink coat looks cool, I want that. It's just all about me. It's not really any concern about others. It's unlikely those kinds of people will become vegan. So yeah, what do you think about that, Austin?
I think that was well said, and that really is a common trend among people who, don't go vegan when exposed to the truth, is they feel as though they're the center of the universe. Everything has to revolve around them all the time. They don't care about how their actions impact others. Everything is about, how can I benefit? How can I gain from this situation? What can benefit me, or what can pleasure me, or maybe I'll get pleasure from the way a dead body tastes, so therefore it's acceptable to prey on animals, without becoming cognizant of the fact that animals are being enslaved and tormented and being treated as an object to satisfy this desire. And it is, I think, linked with sociopathy. You made the point earlier that a lot of serial killers start out preying on animals, and I've read studies on this too, that it's actually one of the greatest, if not the greatest, predictive factors for serial killers and other types of predatory people, is first preying on animals. And I think the reason why this is because animals are the most vulnerable and accessible potential victims. I would say that makes a degree of the injustice even worse. I would say the more innocent and the more vulnerable the victim is, the worse the injustice actually is. And of course, because animals are so vulnerable to people, that is where selfish, sociopathic people get their start, often before graduating, to humans from their perspective, of course. So yeah, just my
Yeah,
2 cents on that.
I want to add
Before
one
we
thing.
close up,
Yeah,
what's that?
when you mentioned on my point about people practicing on animals and preying on them, like a lot of people like to point fingers and blame others for doing something wrong. Like they blame society, they blame others without taking a look in the mirror. So as we have a society where it's normalized to prey on animals, to exploit them, to treat them like nothing, to cut their heads off, as long as this society is perpetuated, we're gonna have constantly serial killers, mass shooters, just evil people who prey on humans, because it's already normal in society to look at some as preyable, look at some as worthless, as insignificant. So, all the non-vegans who look at the news aghast and in horror at the people who are killing, who are shooting up people and doing horrible acts of violence toward humans, they need to look in the mirror because they are directly propping up this culture where some lives are just seen as dispensable, as nothing, that we can exploit them, we can prey on them. And it's because we have this society where that's normal. There's going to be a small amount of those people who will just use that as practice. We're going to prey on animals. We're going to, practice torturing them and get a kick out of it because that's training them to later on oppress humans. So until everyone looks in the mirror, until we make veganism normal, we're going to have this sick society where some people, some beings are just objectified, seen as nothing. And as long as that is in place, there's going to be a constant cycle of wrong, of mass atrocity, of mass killing. It starts with seeing, seemingly insignificant beings, a spider, a chicken, a bunny, seeing them and respecting them. How are you going to grow up to oppress and dominate other humans? Because at the end of the day, it's just different sizes, shapes, and colors. They all have an individual subjective experience that should be respected. It doesn't matter what species, what clade, what genus you belong to. So yeah, that's something I wanted to add here. Yeah.
That's very well said. And you're absolutely right. And I think this is one of the foundations of cognitive dissonance throughout society, where a lot of people do view themselves as good people or view themselves as having a sense of justice. But meanwhile, every single day of their lives, multiple times per day, they're doing something to exploit, prey on, and dominate the innocent. So on some level, they're continually engaged in this cycle of predation. And as such, it only, comes consequentially that at some point they're going to prey on other humans. And I don't view there to be this huge separation or difference between the two of preying on animals and preying on humans. I view them as sort of like one and the same. It's predatory behavior, with a victim. So of course, how can we take people who they think it's acceptable to enslave and cause innocent beings agony for something as gratuitous as taste pleasure, and then think that's going to be a civil or just society, and think that there's not going to be serial killers or serious criminals when their entire lives are taught that it is acceptable to prey on others for one's gain. So I think that was a really good point. Before we close out the episode, I just want to go back on one point that I made earlier, is that being vegan isn't contingent on having or lacking any specific trait or emotional state. It's a standalone ethical principle. But in this episode, we went over traits that people tend to have or tend to lack that is a factor in whether or not they accept veganism as a way to understand other people, more so than create some kind of a barrier. It's just an exercise in understanding our fellow humans and what person potentially changes when faced with the truth and what person potentially doesn't change. Veganism stands strong on its own regardless of the feelings of people. So any sort of an emotional response that people have to veganism, such as apathy or selfishness or victim mentality, they don't change the reality that animals don't deserve to be exploited by humans. They don't change the ethical bedrock of veganism. So I just wanted to end on that point there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important to emphasize. Like, we're not saying like if you have this trait or lack this trait and you can't become vegan. It's just the correlates that we see, and this is a bit of a psychology episode. We're talking about human nature, talking about traits that we see that correlate with one direction or the other. And if you can think of any others that we didn't mention, we'd be happy to hear you mention them. So go ahead, leave a comment. We'd definitely be curious to hear any traits or qualities that we've missed, because there's a lot that we could have included and that we may have not thought of. So yeah, we'll be happy to hear from you. And Chris signing out.
Thank you. Peace.